It was once the greatest city in the Christian world, home to emperors who saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire endured wars, plagues, revolts, and religious divisions. And yet its story remains largely forgotten by many. Why did this Eastern Empire outlast the Western Roman Empire by nearly 1,000 years?
And what finally brought it to an end?
This is the entire story of the Byzantine Empire. Let's begin. In the early 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire stood at a crossroads. After centuries of expansion, civil wars, and political instability, the empire had become too vast to govern effectively. Its territories stretched from the wind-swept shores of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Tigris River. Ruling such a massive and diverse realm from a single capital, Rome, was becoming impossible. And Rome itself, once the mighty heart of imperial power, was no longer suited for the challenges of a changing empire. The man who recognized this and took bold action was Flavius Valerius Constantinus, known to history as Constantine the Great. Born in the late 3rd century in what is now Serbia, Constantine rose through the ranks of the Roman army and emerged victorious in a brutal struggle for control over the empire. By the year 324, he stood as the sole ruler of the Roman world. But Constantine did not simply wish to restore the old order. He wanted to transform it. His reign marked a new chapter in Roman history, one defined by a stronger imperial presence in the East and a closer union between the state and the Christian faith. Among his most consequential decisions was the founding of a new imperial capital. He chose the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, located on the Bosporus Strait, as the place where Rome would be reborn. The choice was no coincidence. Byzantium sat at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, with direct access to both the Aegean and Black Seas. Its strategic position allowed for easier control of trade and military routes, especially in the wealthier eastern provinces. But Constantine's choice also carried deep symbolism. It reflected his vision of a Christian empire. While Rome remained tied to its pagan heritage and old senatorial traditions, this new city would be a Christian capital, free from the burdens of the past. In building this new center of power, Constantine was not merely constructing a city, he was crafting a new identity for the empire itself. Construction began around 324 CE. Gigantic defensive walls encircled the peninsula. Aqueducts were laid to bring water, and magnificent churches rose to symbolize the empire's changing faith. In 330 CE, the city was officially dedicated as Nova Roma, New Rome, though it soon became known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This moment did not mark the end of Rome, but rather the beginning of a gradual shift in the empire's center of gravity. Rome would remain symbolically revered, but Constantinople would grow in wealth, influence, and political power. Constantine's reforms extended far beyond architecture. His monetary changes stabilized the empire's finances with the introduction of the gold solidus, a coin that would dominate trade for centuries. He reorganized the army, creating mobile field forces to respond swiftly to frontier threats. Most importantly, he took decisive steps toward legitimizing Christianity. Although he did not make it the official religion of the empire, his Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted Christians religious tolerance and restored church properties previously confiscated. He also convened the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, a pivotal moment that helped shape Christian doctrine. Constantine's support for the church, both politically and financially, ensured Christianity's deep integration into the empire's identity. Yet these changes didn't occur in isolation. The Roman Empire had already been evolving through crisis. The 3rd century was a time of chaos, rapid emperor turnovers, invasions, and economic collapse. Earlier rulers, such as Diocletian, had already attempted to reform the empire, even dividing it into eastern and western halves for easier governance. Constantine built upon these foundations, but his decision to move the capital eastward was revolutionary and enduring. As Constantinople grew, it became a reflection of Constantine's grand vision. It was a city of marble palaces, busy marketplaces, splendid churches, and powerful walls. It mirrored Rome with its Senate house and chariot racing arena, yet it looked toward a new Eastern world. Latin remained the language of the administration, but over time, Greek became the language of the people. By the time of Constantine's death in 337 CE, his city was already the new heart of the empire. Successive emperors expanded and fortified it, making it one of the greatest capitals of the ancient world. Constantine was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by 12 empty sarcophagi, symbolizing the apostles, a gesture portraying him as both ruler and servant of divine will. The founding of Constantinople was not simply urban development, it was the birth of a new empire. This city would become the heart of a civilization that survived long after the Western Roman Empire fell. Its walls would withstand sieges that destroyed kingdoms elsewhere. Its scholars would preserve ancient wisdom, and its emperors would continue to call themselves Romans, successors of Augustus and Constantine. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. Repeated invasions, economic ruin, and political chaos brought it to its knees. Finally, in 476 CE, the Germanic leader, Odoacer, deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. With that, imperial rule in the West ended. But the Roman Empire itself did not vanish. It lived on in the East. From Constantinople, it continued to function, ruled by emperors who still claimed to be heirs of Rome. For those living in the East, the fall of the West was a distant event. Life, trade, and governance carried on. The emperor still ruled. Rome had not fallen, it had simply moved. Historians later called this Eastern Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire, though its people never used that name. They called themselves Romans, their rulers emperors of Rome, and their laws Roman. But over time, the character of the empire began to change. The East was more stable than the West for many reasons. Its provinces, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, were wealthier, more urbanized, and better connected through trade. Constantinople itself was nearly impregnable, surrounded by water on 3 sides and protected by massive triple walls. The Eastern emperors also had stronger control over their armies and greater tax revenue. At the time of Rome's fall, the Eastern emperor was Zeno. His reign was marked by internal unrest and theological disputes, but he managed to survive in office, a sign of the East's resilience. When Odoacer toppled Romulus Augustulus, he did not claim the imperial title. Instead, he recognized Zeno as the sole Roman emperor, a symbolic but telling act. It confirmed that true imperial authority now rested in Constantinople. Still, the loss of the West was both a challenge and an opportunity. The East no longer faced rival emperors, but it also carried the burden of representing the whole Roman idea. It claimed to be the one true empire of all Christians, yet much of the old Roman world now lay beyond its reach. This tension shaped Byzantine identity for centuries. The belief that their empire was universal, divinely ordained to rule the civilized world, remained central to their worldview. But in practice, the empire turned inward, refining its systems and preserving what it could. The imperial court in Constantinople became the center of political life. Bureaucrats, eunuchs, and palace officials wielded immense power. The emperor's proximity to the church and the army made palace intrigues dangerous and frequent. Religion, too, continued to evolve. The 4th and 5th centuries saw fierce debates about Christian doctrine, especially regarding the divine and human nature of Christ. Disputes between Chalcedonian Christians and Monophysites caused deep divisions, especially in Egypt and Syria. These theological conflicts often turned political, sparking revolts and weakening provinces. Yet through all this turmoil, the Eastern Empire endured. Its tax system, though heavy, remained efficient. Its governors and generals were capable. Its army was disciplined and adaptable. And above all, it remained focused on its eastern frontiers, particularly the ongoing rivalry with the Sassanid Persian Empire. The two great powers of the ancient world, Rome and Persia, had clashed for centuries. Wars alternated with fragile truces, trade flourished even amid tension, and diplomacy occasionally bound them through marriage or alliance. Each viewed the other as both a rival and a mirror of its own ambition. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, however, new forces began to rise, tribes and kingdoms that would reshape the map of Europe. To the north, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great established a new realm in Italy. The Vandals seized North Africa. The Visigoths ruled much of Spain. These were not minor invasions. They were the birth of a new world order, one in which the old Rome had fallen, but its spirit continued to live on through Byzantium. They became the foundations of new kingdoms on lands that had once belonged to Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire did not immediately respond with force. Instead, it watched and waited. It signed treaties when necessary, offered bribes to potential adversaries, and sought to maintain influence through diplomacy. During this period, the empire's approach was cautious, focused more on preserving what remained than reclaiming what had been lost. Yet such restraint could not last forever. In the early 6th century, a new emperor would ascend the throne in Constantinople with a radically different vision. He believed the empire could and should restore its former glory. His name was Justinian, and his reign would initiate one of the most ambitious eras of military and legal reform in Byzantine history. But even before his rise, the Eastern Roman Empire was already transforming. Though its citizens still called themselves Romans and its emperors still wore the purple, the world around them was changing. The Latin West had given way to barbarian kingdoms. The church had become central to state authority. The imperial capital was no longer Rome, but Constantinople, and the legacy of Rome now rested in Eastern hands. In the early 6th century, a new emperor came to power in the Eastern Roman Empire, one whose rule would leave an enduring imprint on Byzantine history. This was Justinian, later known as Justinian the Great, whose reign marked one of the most transformative and ambitious periods of the empire. From sweeping military campaigns to the codification of Roman law, and from grand architectural projects to profound cultural influence, Justinian sought nothing less than the full restoration of Roman greatness. Justinian was born around 482 in a village in the Roman province of Dardania, in the Balkans. He was not born into wealth or prominence, but his uncle Justin served in the imperial guard and would eventually become emperor. When Justin assumed the throne in 518, he brought his nephew to Constantinople and provided him with an exceptional education in law, theology, and imperial administration. Upon Justin's death in 527, Justinian ascended to the throne. From the outset, Justinian's ambitions were high. He aimed to reassert Roman authority over Western territories lost to Germanic kingdoms, restore centralized imperial power, and consolidate religious unity across the empire. These goals demanded immense resources, unyielding determination, and a skilled team of generals and administrators. Among his most trusted military leaders was Belisarius, a brilliant general who became central to Justinian's campaigns. Under Belisarius, the Byzantine army launched a series of expeditions to reclaim former Roman lands. The first major target was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. In 533, Belisarius led a fleet across the Mediterranean and defeated the Vandals in just months, restoring the wealthy province of Carthage to imperial control. Encouraged by this success, Justinian turned his attention to Italy, ruled by the Ostrogoths since the late 5th century. Starting in 535, Belisarius began a protracted campaign to seize Italy. The conflict, known as the Gothic War, would drag on for nearly 2 decades. Though Belisarius initially captured Rome and Ravenna, the war continued as new Gothic leaders emerged, devastating much of the Italian peninsula. In the end, the Byzantines prevailed, but at tremendous cost. Simultaneously, the empire fought campaigns in the east against the Sassanid Persians. While results were mixed, these campaigns demonstrated Justinian's determination to defend and, where possible, expand the empire's frontiers on multiple fronts. Yet Justinian's ambitions extended beyond warfare. One of his most enduring legacies was the comprehensive reform of Roman law. Over centuries, Roman legal texts had become vast, contradictory, and unwieldy. In 529, Justinian appointed the Juris Tribonian to organize and clarify this sprawling body of law. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, a multi-volume compilation including the Codex Justinianus, the Digest, the Institutes, and later the Novellae. This codification did more than streamline Roman jurisprudence. It created a coherent legal system that shaped Byzantine governance for centuries and later influenced civil law traditions throughout Europe, remaining a cornerstone of modern legal systems. Justinian also profoundly shaped the religious life of his empire. A devout Christian, he saw himself as a defender of orthodoxy and used imperial authority to promote religious unity. He actively persecuted heretical groups, including Arians, Monophysites, and pagans, and sought to align the church more closely with the state. His religious policies, however, often created as much tension as unity. The Monophysite controversy, focused on the nature of Christ, continued to divide Christians in the eastern provinces. While Justinian attempted to enforce Chalcedonian orthodoxy, his efforts alienated large segments of the population, particularly in Egypt and Syria, where monophysitism had deep roots. Despite these internal challenges, Justinian's reign saw extraordinary cultural and architectural achievements. Nowhere is this more evident than in the construction of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. After the previous church was destroyed during the Nika riots, a massive uprising that nearly toppled Justinian, he commissioned a new, grander church. Completed in 537, Hagia Sophia was a marvel of engineering and artistry, with a massive dome symbolizing the union of heaven and earth. It would stand for over 9 centuries as the central church of Eastern Christianity. The Nika riots themselves highlighted the fragility of imperial authority. In 532, tensions erupted between rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, whose influence extended far beyond the hippodrome into political and social life. What began as a sporting rivalry escalated into a full-scale rebellion, with much of Constantinople set ablaze. The rioters demanded the emperor's abdication and even proclaimed a new ruler. Justinian considered fleeing the city, but it was his wife, Theodora, who persuaded him to stay.
A former actress turned empress, she wielded enormous influence at court.
She reportedly told Justinian, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," urging him to fight rather than surrender. Justinian ordered Belisarius and another general to storm the hippodrome, where thousands of rebels had gathered. The resulting massacre crushed the revolt and reasserted imperial authority. Theodora's role extended beyond this crisis. She served as a trusted advisor and co-ruler, shaping policies on social issues, particularly the rights of women and the poor. Her rise from humble origins made her one of the most remarkable figures in Byzantine history. By the end of Justinian's reign, the empire had reached its greatest territorial extent in centuries, controlling parts of Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain, alongside its eastern heartlands. Yet this achievement came at a cost. Military campaigns drained the treasury, wars and riots weakened urban centers, and the eastern Mediterranean remained precarious. During Justinian's ambitious campaigns, a hidden threat emerged, one that would challenge the very foundations of the Byzantine state. In 541, a deadly pandemic swept across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, halting imperial expansion and ushering in demographic collapse and economic strain. This event, known as the Plague of Justinian, was one of the first recorded pandemics in history. With devastating consequences, the plague likely originated in Egypt, a vital grain-producing province of the empire. From there, it spread along trade routes connecting the empire's vast territories. It reached Constantinople in the spring of 541, overwhelming the city's public health infrastructure, which was ill-prepared for such a crisis. Contemporary accounts, most notably by the historian Procopius, describe the plague's arrival with grim clarity. At the peak of the outbreak, as many as 5,000 people died daily in Constantinople, with some estimates reaching 10,000, bodies piled in the streets. Graves could not be dug fast enough, and fear gripped the population. The disease was likely bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rodents, the same pathogen responsible for the Black Death centuries later. Once in Constantinople, it swept through the population indiscriminately. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the illness but survived, though his strength never fully returned. The human toll was catastrophic. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Constantinople's residents. Across the empire, tens of millions perished over successive waves of infection. The demographic consequences were immediate. Entire villages emptied.
Agricultural production collapsed.
Tax revenues fell as peasants and landowners died in staggering numbers. Cities shrank, and the army, already stretched thin, faced severe manpower shortages. These losses struck at the core of imperial power. Justinian's grand ambitions for restoring the empire ground to a halt. While earlier campaigns had expanded Byzantine control into the western Mediterranean, the plague made retaining these gains nearly impossible. Resources were diverted to address the crisis, slowing military operations and weakening newly conquered territories. The plague also disrupted the empire's complex bureaucracy. Byzantine governance depended on a vast administrative network to collect taxes, maintain infrastructure, and enforce law. With so many officials dead or incapacitated, local administration faltered. Communication between provinces broke down, and imperial orders went unheeded. The empire's internal cohesion began to strain. Economic disruption was equally severe. Trade declined as merchants avoided infected ports and caravan routes. Grain shipments, vital to feeding Constantinople and other cities, became inconsistent. Prices soared, labor shortages caused unrest, and many large estates collapsed due to the deaths of owners and workers. The psychological impact was profound. The plague shook spiritual confidence. Many interpreted it as divine punishment, a sign of displeasure with the emperor, the church, or society. Religious processions, penitential rituals, and appeals to saints increased. In some cases, heretical groups argued that the empire had strayed from true faith. The clergy, often at the forefront of caring for the sick and burying the dead, suffered high mortality as well. This left vacancies in bishops' seats and monastic communities, further destabilizing religious institutions. Yet the church also gained influence as many people turned to faith for comfort and understanding in a crisis beyond human control. Despite overwhelming challenges, the Byzantine state did not collapse. Its survival in the face of such devastation is a testament to the resilience of its structures. However, the plague marked a turning point. The empire that emerged from this catastrophe was more cautious, defensive, and constrained in its ambitions. One of the clearest consequences was a shift in imperial policy. In the years following the initial outbreak, Justinian and his successors increasingly turned inward. Resources that had once supported military campaigns were redirected toward reconstruction, both physical and administrative. Public works in Constantinople resumed, but on a smaller scale. Fortifications were repaired. Roads were cleared. Rural populations were resettled where possible. At the same time, the empire's geopolitical situation began to shift. The Western conquests, particularly in Italy, became increasingly difficult to maintain. The long and bloody Gothic War had left the peninsula in ruins. Now, with fewer soldiers and less money, Byzantine control was fragile. In some regions, local rulers began asserting autonomy, foreshadowing the fragmentation that would characterize later centuries. The eastern frontier also posed renewed challenges. The Sassanid Empire, though affected by the plague as well, remained a powerful rival. Border skirmishes and diplomatic tensions persisted, and the weakened Byzantine army struggled to respond forcefully. Even as the empire contracted in some areas, it adapted. Tax remissions were introduced in regions hardest hit by the plague, acknowledging that economic hardship could not be met with rigid demands. Monasteries and church institutions, less reliant on central bureaucracy, became important providers of social services. In rural areas, local landowners assumed greater roles in maintaining order, a trend that would later influence medieval feudal structures. Culturally, the trauma of the plague shaped perceptions of the world and humanity's place in it. Histories, sermons, and hagiographies from this period reflected both vulnerability and resilience, emphasizing survival, divine mercy, and renewal. By the time the worst of the plague subsided in the mid-540s, the empire had been fundamentally altered. Justinian remained on the throne, but his vigor had waned. The grand reconquest gave way to the pressing task of preservation. The Hagia Sophia still stood in majesty. The Corpus Juris Civilis remained in force, but defending the empire's boundaries was now far more difficult. Its population had diminished, and confidence was shaken. Following the mid-6th century devastation, the Byzantine Empire faced a radically different world. Its population was reduced, the economy weakened, and military resources stretched thin. Yet threats did not pause for recovery. From the eastern deserts to the Balkan forests, emerging powers and aggressive tribes tested the empire's resilience and exposed its vulnerabilities. In the east, the long-standing rivalry with the Sassanid Persian Empire erupted once more. The Sassanids, ruled by kings such as Khosrow I and his successors, had recovered more quickly than Byzantium from the pandemic. By the late 6th century, they launched renewed offensives into Byzantine territory, exploiting the empire's weakened state. One of the most brutal wars occurred during the reign of Emperor Maurice, who ruled from the late 6th century into the early 7th. Maurice inherited an empire struggling to defend its frontiers. He attempted to stabilize the Balkans through military campaigns and diplomatic alliances while managing frequent clashes with Persia. Though he secured some victories, including favorable peace terms with the Sassanids, internal dissatisfaction proved fatal. In the early 7th century, Maurice was overthrown and executed during a military revolt, and a general named Phocas seized the throne. Phocas's reign brought deep instability. His legitimacy was questioned, his policies erratic, and he was unpopular with both the army and the people. This chaos provided Persia with the perfect opportunity to strike. Khosrow II used Maurice's murder as a pretext to break the peace treaty. In one of the most destructive wars between the two empires, Persian armies rapidly advanced into Byzantine territory, capturing Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. By the early 7th century, the Sassanids had reached Chalcedon directly across the Bosporus from Constantinople. The loss of Egypt was particularly catastrophic. It had long been one of the empire's most valuable provinces, supplying much of the grain that fed Constantinople. Meanwhile, religious divisions further complicated resistance. Many inhabitants of recently conquered eastern provinces, especially Egypt and Syria, were Monophysite Christians alienated from the Chalcedonian orthodoxy promoted by the imperial government. This estrangement made local populations less willing to resist Persian occupation. As Byzantium reeled from Persian advances in the east, a new challenge emerged in the Balkans. The Danube frontier along the northern boundary had grown increasingly vulnerable. The Avars, a confederation of nomadic horsemen from Central Asia, began moving into the region. Skilled in siege warfare and mounted combat, they posed a major threat to the Balkan provinces and Constantinople itself. Alongside the Avars came another group that would reshape southeastern Europe, the Slavs. Unlike the nomadic Avars, the slaves were settled agriculturalists. During the late 6th and early 7th centuries, they gradually migrated into the Balkans, filling the power vacuum left by weakening Byzantine defenses. Over time, they established permanent settlements, intermingled with local populations, and laid the foundations for future Slavic nations. The combination of Avar raids and Slavic migrations brought a slow but irreversible transformation to the Balkan heartland. Cities that had once thrived under Roman and Byzantine rule were destroyed or abandoned. Fortified towns became isolated outposts. The imperial administration could no longer maintain consistent control over vast territories. Pressure from the north and east forced Byzantium to reconsider its strategic priorities. With the western provinces largely lost and the eastern provinces under occupation, survival now hinged on protecting Constantinople and securing Asia Minor. Asia Minor, with its mountainous terrain and established fortresses, became the main recruiting ground for the army and a refuge for displaced populations from Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The military and political crisis peaked during the reign of Emperor Heraclius, who ascended the throne in the early 7th century after overthrowing the deeply unpopular Phocas. Heraclius inherited an empire that was territorially decimated, financially bankrupt, and politically fractured. Yet he proved a determined and energetic leader. One of his first major acts was to reorganize the empire's military and administrative structure. He began establishing the theme system, dividing Asia Minor into military districts, each governed by a general responsible for both civil administration and defense. This allowed the empire to respond more flexibly to external threats, with local forces able to mobilize quickly without waiting for central orders. With his power consolidated and administration restructured, Heraclius launched an audacious campaign to drive the Persians out of Byzantine lands. Between 622 and 627, he marched deep into Persian territory, bypassing defensive lines and threatening the Persian heartland. These campaigns culminated in a decisive victory at the Battle of Nineveh, after which Persian resistance crumbled. Khosrow II was soon overthrown and executed by his own nobles, and peace was restored. The Byzantines regained their lost provinces, including Egypt and the Levant. For a brief moment, it seemed that Heraclius had restored the empire to its former glory. But this victory was short-lived. Years of war had exhausted both empires. Their armies were depleted, treasuries drained, and populations weary. Into this fragile balance emerged a new force from the Arabian Peninsula, one that neither Byzantium nor Persia had anticipated. Unlike previous enemies, this new power was ideological, military, and civilizational all at once. From the deserts of Arabia, the followers of a new faith, Islam surged onto the world stage, poised to transform the political and religious
Map of the Eastern Mediterranean within
decades. The rise of Islam began with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century in Mecca. After his death, the Rashidun Caliphate, the first Islamic state, emerged under the rightly guided caliphs. Within a few years, these leaders launched rapid military campaigns, bringing them into direct conflict with both the Byzantine and Sassanid empires. This expansion was fueled by religious conviction, political unity among Arab tribes, economic necessity, and opportunism. For Byzantium, the timing could not have been worse. Wars with Persia had left the eastern provinces politically unstable and militarily exhausted. Although Heraclius had won a celebrated victory over the Sassanids, his forces were drained, the treasury nearly empty, and large portions of the population, particularly in Syria and Egypt, religiously alienated due to ongoing Christological controversies. The first major clash between Byzantines and Arab forces occurred in the early 630s. A pivotal moment came at the Battle of Yarmouk, fought near the borders of modern Syria and Jordan. Here, the Byzantine army suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of the forces of Caliph Umar, led by Khalid ibn al-Walid. Yarmouk marked a turning point, shattering Byzantine power in Syria and opening the gates for the Islamic conquest of the Levant. Following this victory, Arab forces rapidly captured key provinces. Damascus fell, followed by Jerusalem, territories of immense religious and strategic significance. These losses signaled the start of a new religious and cultural era in the region. The Arab armies did not stop at the Levant. By the mid-7th century, they had advanced into Egypt, one of Byzantium's most valuable provinces. Egypt's fertile lands and grain exports had long been central to the empire's economy. But Byzantine control over Egypt was not merely economic. It symbolized the empire's Roman and Christian identity. Its loss to the caliphate represented a serious blow to both Byzantine prestige and practical capacity. The conquest of Egypt was relatively swift. Byzantine garrisons were undermanned, and the local population, largely monophysite in religious orientation, had little loyalty to Constantinople. Many Egyptians viewed the Arab conquerors as preferable to imperial officials who had long persecuted their beliefs. This ambivalence, or in some cases passive support, rendered resistance fragmented and ineffective. By the end of the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire had lost not only Syria and Egypt, but also parts of Mesopotamia and Armenia. These regions had once been the heartlands of Hellenistic and Christian civilization. Now they became part of a new Islamic world governed from Damascus by the Umayyad Caliphate. The rapid loss of these provinces forced Byzantium to confront a radically altered reality. Imperial borders had contracted dramatically. The empire's population was smaller, its tax base reduced, and its reach across the Mediterranean curtailed. The vision of Byzantium as a universal empire gave way to a more modest regional self-conception. Yet the empire did not collapse. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period was Byzantium's ability to adapt and survive despite catastrophic losses. A central strength lay in the resilience of Constantinople itself. Protected by formidable land and sea walls and supplied through control of strategic sea lanes in the Aegean and Black Seas, the city remained unconquered even as surrounding provinces fell. It became not only the political center, but also the psychological and spiritual anchor of the empire. This resilience was vividly demonstrated during the first Arab siege of Constantinople in the 670s under the Umayyad Caliphate. Having secured bases in Syria and Egypt, the Arab navies sailed north to challenge the capital directly. For years, the siege continued intermittently, with fleets blockading the Bosporus and launching repeated assaults. But the Byzantines held firm. A key defensive innovation during this time was the use of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon projected from ships that could ignite enemy vessels even on water. Its exact composition remains unknown, but its psychological and tactical impact was profound. Greek fire secured Byzantine naval superiority and helped break the siege. The defense of Constantinople preserved the existence of the Byzantine state and likely altered the course of European history. While military resilience was critical, administrative adaptation was equally important. Facing a reduced empire, Byzantine rulers reformed state organization. One key development was the evolution of the theme system, allowing local military governors to oversee both civil and military affairs. This decentralized structure reduced the burden on the capital and allowed for faster regional responses to threats, both cultural and religious. This period also marked a transition in the centers of Christian learning. With Eastern schools lost, Constantinople emerged decisively as the leading authority of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of Constantinople assumed a central role in defining doctrine, maintaining ecclesiastical order, and advising the emperor. By the end of the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was smaller, poorer, and more isolated than under Justinian, yet it was more cohesive in some respects. The religious and linguistic diversity of the earlier empire gave way to a more uniformly Greek-speaking and Chalcedonian Christian population. The cultural synthesis of Roman administration, Christian faith, and Hellenic traditions formed the backbone of Byzantine civilization. The Arab conquests, though devastating, forced Byzantium to adapt. No longer could it imagine itself as the center of a world empire ruling over multiple peoples and faiths. Instead, it became a Christian bulwark, preserving the faith and Roman traditions amid rising powers and ideologies. In the 8th and 9th centuries, long after the empire's richest provinces were lost and Constantinople defended against Arab sieges, Byzantium faced a new internal conflict over sacred images. This period, known as the iconoclast controversy, dominated Byzantine politics and religious life for over a century. It divided emperors and patriarchs, monks and generals, families and congregations. At stake was more than theology. It was a battle over imperial authority, the church-state relationship, and the identity of Byzantine Christianity. The controversy began under Emperor Leo III, who ruled in the early 8th century. In 726, he issued an edict condemning the veneration of icons, religious images depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. This shocked the empire and triggered events that shook Byzantium to its core. Leo's motivations remain debated. Some suggest influence from neighboring Islamic and Jewish traditions, which forbade religious imagery. Others argue political motives. By attacking monasteries, strongholds of icon veneration, and often independent of imperial control, Leo sought to centralize authority and reassert state power. The result was immediate and explosive. Icon veneration was central to Byzantine religious life, worship, public processions, and private devotion. Icons were believed to mediate divine presence and were credited with miracles, particularly during sieges and disasters. To forbid them was not a theological adjustment, it was an assault on spiritual life. The edict sparked unrest in Constantinople. Riots erupted in some provinces. Imperial officials enforcing the ban faced rebellion. Monasteries became centers of resistance as monks refused to abandon icons, often facing arrest, exile, or execution. Theologians drew sharp lines between iconoclasts, opponents of images, and iconodules, defenders of them. Iconoclasts argued images violated biblical prohibitions against graven images and risked idolatry. Iconodules countered that Christ's incarnation made depiction both acceptable and necessary. Since God took human form, representing him was spiritually meaningful. The controversy escalated under Leo's son and successor, Constantine III, who aggressively persecuted iconodules. A major council in 754 condemned icon veneration as heretical. Thousands of icons were destroyed, churches stripped, monastic property confiscated, and dissenters imprisoned or executed. This era redefined emperor-church relations. Emperors claimed the right to dictate doctrine. Patriarchs opposing iconoclasm were replaced. Symphonia, the ideal balance of church and state, tilted toward imperial dominance. Opposition did not disappear. John of Damascus, a monk under Muslim rule, defended icons, arguing they educated the faithful, honored, not worshipped, holy figures, and affirmed the incarnation. Though outside Byzantium, his writings became foundational for iconodule thought. Resistance grew as imperial fortunes declined. Earlier victories of iconoclast emperors gave way to defeats, raising doubts about divine favor. Many believed icons still protected the empire. A turning point came with the death of Constantine V's son, Leo IV, and the regency of his wife, Empress Irene. As regent for her young son Constantine VI, Irene, a committed iconodule, ruled in her own right. In 787 she convened the Second Council of Nicaea, formally restoring icon veneration. The council, recognized by both Eastern and Western churches, affirmed icons as legitimate and deserving of reverence. The restoration was a major victory for monasticism and ecclesiastical authority. Yet the controversy continued briefly. A second wave of iconoclasm emerged under Leo V in the early 9th century, removing icons and persecuting defenders. Although less intense, it prolonged religious strife. The final resolution came under Empress Theodora. Regent for her son Michael III, in 843, she oversaw the definitive restoration of icon veneration. commemorated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. This ended official iconoclasm, solidifying the theological position of iconodules. The century-long conflict left deep scars. It weakened monastic institutions, strained church-state relations, and exposed Byzantine internal fragility. Yet, it clarified theological positions that would shape Eastern Orthodoxy for centuries. The controversy also widened the gap between Eastern and Western churches. While the Pope supported iconodules and recognized the Second Council of Nicaea, Byzantine policy caused confusion and mistrust. Papal authority and imperial claims over doctrine increasingly diverged, laying groundwork for future divisions. By the mid-9th century, Byzantium began to emerge from iconoclasm. With more unified religious policy, a maturing military system, and resilient administration, the empire entered a period of revival. This would become the Macedonian Renaissance, a cultural and military flowering propelling the empire into its next golden age. Following the turmoil, Byzantium needed renewal. Its borders had contracted, internal unity shaken, and past glories seemed distant. With the rise of the Macedonian dynasty in the late 9th century, the empire embarked on military, administrative, and cultural revival. This era, called the Macedonian Renaissance, marked a high point in Byzantine history. For over a century and a half, the empire expanded, reformed institutions, and flourished intellectually and artistically. The dynasty began with Basil I, of humble Macedonian origins, possibly Armenian. Through charisma, intelligence, and loyalty to Emperor Michael III, Basil rose through the imperial court. He became co-emperor, and following Michael's death under suspicious circumstances, sole ruler in 867, Basil was not scholarly, but a shrewd administrator. He reorganized the legal system, compiled a new code called the Basilica, and stabilized finances. His reforms laid the foundation for the strength of his successors. Though his reign emphasized consolidation over conquest, it initiated internal recovery and institutional growth. The real flowering of the Macedonian period began under his son, Leo VI, known as Leo the Wise. A deeply learned emperor fluent in theology, philosophy, and classical literature, Leo transformed the court into a center of intellectual activity. Legal reforms continued, and Leo expanded and clarified his father's code. He also issued his own legal treatises and sermons, seeking to harmonize imperial authority with moral and religious guidance. Leo VI also faced multiple military challenges. The empire was pressured on several fronts: Arab raids in the east, Bulgarian expansion in the Balkans, and instability in southern Italy. While Leo's campaigns were not always successful, he strengthened the navy and reasserted Byzantine presence across the Mediterranean. Under Constantine VII, Leo's son, the cultural and administrative revival deepened. Constantine is remembered not only as an emperor, but also as a scholar. He personally commissioned and contributed to several significant works, including De Administrando Imperio, a political and geographic manual designed to guide future rulers, and De Ceremoniis, which described the elaborate rituals of the imperial court. These texts reveal much about the ideology of the Macedonian court. The emperor was presented not only as a ruler, but as a guardian of divine order, presiding over a world shaped by tradition, law, and orthodoxy. Court rituals emphasized continuity with Roman grandeur, while expressing a distinct Byzantine identity. Christian, Greek-speaking, and rooted in Constantinople, military fortunes shifted decisively under the reigns of Nikephoros Phocas and John Tzimiskes, both from elite military families. Nikephoros, who became emperor in the 10th century, had previously led successful campaigns against the Arabs in the east. As emperor, he recaptured Crete, lost to Muslim control for over a century, restoring Byzantine dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. His campaigns extended through Asia Minor and Syria, reclaiming key cities and fortresses. Nikephoros was austere, often sleeping on a bare board and wearing coarse garments beneath his imperial robes. His strictness and heavy taxation made him unpopular, and he was eventually assassinated in a palace coup led by his own general and successor. John Zimisces. John continued military efforts, securing victories in the east and reaffirming Byzantine influence in the Balkans. He also repaired relations with the church and court elites, easing tensions that had grown under Nikephoros. These military successes boosted morale and helped finance further administrative and cultural development. The pinnacle of the Macedonian Renaissance came under Basil II, one of the longest reigning and most formidable Byzantine emperors. Known as the Bulgar Slayer, Basil ruled for nearly 5 decades at the turn of the 11th century. He spent much of his reign in military campaigns, especially in the Balkans, where the Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel posed a serious threat. The war against Bulgaria was long and brutal, marked by sieges, ambushes, and shifting alliances. Basil pursued relentless strategies, gradually wearing down Bulgarian resistance. After the decisive Battle of Kleidion, Basil reportedly ordered thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers blinded, sending them back to their Tsar in a dramatic psychological display. The Bulgarians surrendered shortly afterward, and their territory was incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. Basil also campaigned successfully in Armenia and the Caucasus, extending Byzantine influence further east. His reign marked the height of medieval Byzantine territorial expansion, from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Euphrates in the east, and from the Danube in the north to the eastern Mediterranean coast. The empire stood once more as a dominant power. Domestically, Basil exercised strict control over the aristocracy. He curtailed the power of large landowners, particularly in Asia Minor, and ensured imperial authority remained centralized. Unlike many predecessors, Basil did not prioritize court pageantry or cultural pursuits. He was a soldier emperor focused on discipline, administration, and military success. Yet culturally, the Macedonian era remained vibrant. Classical texts were copied and preserved. Schools in Constantinople trained bureaucrats in law and rhetoric, and art and architecture reflected both imperial grandeur and Christian devotion. Mosaic art and manuscript illumination reached new heights. The blending of Hellenic, Christian, and Roman traditions gave Byzantine culture its distinctive form. Diplomatically, the empire reasserted its status in the Christian world. The marriage of Princess Anna, Basil II's sister, to Prince Vladimir of Kiev helped initiate the Christianization of Kiev and Rus, and established Byzantine religious and cultural influence in the Slavic world. This alliance had enduring consequences, shaping Orthodox Christianity far beyond the empire's borders. By the end of Basil's reign in the mid-11th century, the empire appeared strong, stable, and ascendant. Yet beneath the surface, challenges loomed. Basil had no heirs, and after his death, succession passed to weaker rulers. The structures he had maintained through personal authority began to erode as powerful aristocratic families sought to regain lost privileges. The balance between central authority and local power became fragile. Still, the Macedonian Renaissance left a profound legacy. It showed that Byzantium could not only survive disaster, but reinvent itself. After centuries of invasions, losses, and internal strife, the empire re-emerged as a confident and creative power. Its military successes, legal reforms, and cultural achievements shaped its identity and image for centuries to come. Byzantium's influence was not limited to military or territorial gains. It expanded through culture, diplomacy, and religion. Among the era's most enduring legacies was the Christianization of the Slavs and the extension of Byzantine religious, artistic, and political traditions across Eastern Europe. The Slavs, who had migrated into the Balkans and surrounding regions during earlier centuries of turmoil, began forming centralized polities by the 9th and 10th centuries. As these states grew, they entered into deeper relations with Byzantium. Religious conversion became a powerful tool of influence. In the Byzantine worldview, spreading Orthodox Christianity was both a spiritual mission and a political one. The emperor, as God's chosen ruler, had a sacred duty to guide non-Christian peoples toward salvation and integrate them into the Christian oikumene, the community of the faithful. Resistance grew as imperial fortunes declined. Earlier victories of iconoclast emperors gave way to defeats, raising doubts about divine favor. Many believed icons still protected the empire. A turning point came with the death of Constantine V's son, Leo IV, and the regency of his wife, Empress Irene. As regent for her young son Constantine VI, Irene, a committed iconodule, ruled in her own right. In 787 she convened the Second Council of Nicaea, formally restoring icon veneration. The council, recognized by both Eastern and Western churches, affirmed icons as legitimate and deserving of reverence. The restoration was a major victory for monasticism and ecclesiastical authority. Yet the controversy continued briefly. A second wave of iconoclasm emerged under Leo V in the early 9th century, removing icons and persecuting defenders. Although less intense, it prolonged religious strife. The final resolution came under Empress Theodora. Regent for her son Michael III, in 843, she oversaw the definitive restoration of icon veneration, commemorated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. This ended official iconoclasm, solidifying the theological position of iconodules. The century-long conflict left deep scars. It weakened monastic institutions, strained church-state relations, and exposed Byzantine internal fragility. Yet, it clarified theological positions that would shape Eastern Orthodoxy for centuries. The controversy also widened the gap between Eastern and Western churches. While the Pope supported iconodules and recognized the Second Council of Nicaea, Byzantine policy caused confusion and mistrust. Papal authority and imperial claims over doctrine increasingly diverged, laying groundwork for future divisions. By the mid-9th century, Byzantium began to emerge from iconoclasm. With more unified religious policy, a maturing military system, and resilient administration, the empire entered a period of revival. This would become the Macedonian Renaissance, a cultural and military flowering propelling the empire into its next golden age. Following the turmoil, Byzantium needed renewal. Its borders had contracted, internal unity shaken, and past glories seemed distant. With the rise of the Macedonian dynasty in the late 9th century, the empire embarked on military, administrative, and cultural revival. This era, called the Macedonian Renaissance, marked a high point in Byzantine history. For over a century and a half, the empire expanded, reformed institutions, and flourished intellectually and artistically. The dynasty began with Basil I, of humble Macedonian origins, possibly Armenian. Through charisma, intelligence, and loyalty to Emperor Michael III, Basil rose through the imperial court. He became co-emperor, and following Michael's death under suspicious circumstances, sole ruler in 867, Basil was not scholarly, but a shrewd administrator. He reorganized the legal system, compiled a new code called the Basilica, and stabilized finances. His reforms laid the foundation for the strength of his successors. Though his reign emphasized consolidation over conquest, it initiated internal recovery and institutional growth. The real flowering of the Macedonian period began under his son, Leo VI, known as Leo the Wise. A deeply learned emperor fluent in theology, philosophy, and classical literature, Leo transformed the court into a center of intellectual activity. Legal reforms continued, and Leo expanded and clarified his father's code. He also issued his own legal treatises and sermons, seeking to harmonize imperial authority with moral and religious guidance. Leo II also faced multiple military challenges. The empire was pressured on several fronts: Arab raids in the east, Bulgarian expansion in the Balkans, and instability in southern Italy. While Leo's campaigns were not always successful, he strengthened the navy and reasserted Byzantine presence across the Mediterranean. Under Constantine VII, Leo's son, the cultural and administrative revival deepened. Constantine is remembered not only as an emperor, but also as a scholar. He personally commissioned and contributed to several significant works, including De Administrando Imperio, a political and geographic manual designed to guide future rulers, and De Ceremoniis, which described the elaborate rituals of the imperial court. These texts reveal much about the ideology of the Macedonian court. The emperor was presented not only as a ruler, but as a guardian of divine order, presiding over a world shaped by tradition, law, and orthodoxy. Court rituals emphasized continuity with Roman grandeur, while expressing a distinct Byzantine identity. Christian, Greek-speaking, and rooted in Constantinople, military fortunes shifted decisively under the reigns of Nikephoros Phocas and John Tzimiskes, both from elite military families. Nikephoros, who became emperor in the 10th century, had previously led successful campaigns against the Arabs in the east. As emperor, he recaptured Crete, lost to Muslim control for over a century, restoring Byzantine dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. His campaigns extended through Asia Minor and Syria, reclaiming key cities and fortresses. Nikephoros was austere, often sleeping on a bare board and wearing coarse garments beneath his imperial robes. His strictness and heavy taxation made him unpopular, and he was eventually assassinated in a palace coup led by his own general and successor. John Tzimiskes. John continued military efforts, securing victories in the east and reaffirming Byzantine influence in the Balkans. He also repaired relations with the church and court elites, easing tensions that had grown under Nikephoros. These military successes boosted morale and helped finance further administrative and cultural development. The pinnacle of the Macedonian Renaissance came under Basil II, one of the longest reigning and most formidable Byzantine emperors. Known as the Bulgar Slayer, Basil ruled for nearly 5 decades at the turn of the 11th century. He spent much of his reign in military campaigns, especially in the Balkans, where the Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel posed a serious threat. The war against Bulgaria was long and brutal, marked by sieges, ambushes, and shifting alliances. Basil pursued relentless strategies, gradually wearing down Bulgarian resistance. After the decisive Battle of Kleidion, Basil reportedly ordered thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers blinded, sending them back to their Tsar in a dramatic psychological display. The Bulgarians surrendered shortly afterward, and their territory was incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. Basil also campaigned successfully in Armenia and the Caucasus, extending Byzantine influence further east. His reign marked the height of medieval Byzantine territorial expansion, from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Euphrates in the east, and from the Danube in the north to the eastern Mediterranean coast. The empire stood once more as a dominant power. Domestically, Basil exercised strict control over the aristocracy. He curtailed the power of large landowners, particularly in Asia Minor, and ensured imperial authority remained centralized. Unlike many predecessors, Basil did not prioritize court pageantry or cultural pursuits. He was a soldier emperor focused on discipline, administration, and military success. Yet culturally, the Macedonian era remained vibrant. Classical texts were copied and preserved. Schools in Constantinople trained bureaucrats in law and rhetoric, and art and architecture reflected both imperial grandeur and Christian devotion. Mosaic art and manuscript illumination reached new heights. The blending of Hellenic, Christian, and Roman traditions gave Byzantine culture its distinctive form. Diplomatically, the empire reasserted its status in the Christian world. The marriage of Princess Anna, Basil II's sister, to Prince Vladimir of Kiev helped initiate the Christianization of Kiev and Rus and established Byzantine religious and cultural influence in the Slavic world. This alliance had enduring consequences, shaping Orthodox Christianity far beyond the empire's borders. By the end of Basil's reign in the mid-11th century, the empire appeared strong, stable, and ascendant. Yet beneath the surface, challenges loomed. Basil had no heirs, and after his death, succession passed to weaker rulers. The structures he had maintained through personal authority began to erode as powerful aristocratic families sought to regain lost privileges. The balance between central authority and local power became fragile. Still, the Macedonian Renaissance left a profound legacy. It showed that Byzantium could not only survive disaster, but reinvent itself. After centuries of invasions, losses, and internal strife, the empire re-emerged as a confident and creative power. Its military successes, legal reforms, and cultural achievements shaped its identity and image for centuries to come. Byzantium's influence was not limited to military or territorial gains. It expanded through culture, diplomacy, and religion. Among the era's most enduring legacies was the Christianization of the Slavs and the extension of Byzantine religious, artistic, and political traditions across Eastern Europe. The Slavs, who had migrated into the Balkans and surrounding regions during earlier centuries of turmoil, began forming centralized polities by the 9th and 10th centuries. As these states grew, they entered into deeper relations with Byzantium. Religious conversion became a powerful tool of influence. In the Byzantine worldview, spreading Orthodox Christianity was both a spiritual mission and a political one. The emperor, as God's chosen ruler, had a sacred duty to guide non-Christian peoples toward salvation and integrate them into the Christian oikumene, the community of the faithful. Significant efforts to convert the Slavs began under Emperor Michael III and Patriarch Photius in the mid-9th century. Two brothers from Thessalonica, Constantine, later Cyril, and Methodius, were sent as missionaries. Fluent in Slavic dialects and knowledgeable in theology and classical literature, they first traveled to Great Moravia, where they introduced a written script for translating the Bible and liturgical texts. This Glagolitic alphabet laid the foundation for the later Cyrillic script, which became the writing system of much of the Slavic Orthodox world. Cyril and Methodius emphasized conducting religious services in the vernacular, allowing for meaningful conversion and cultural integration. This approach distinguished the Byzantine mission from the Latin West, which insisted on Latin as the universal church language. As a result, the Slavs associated Orthodox Christianity with cultural autonomy and native identity. Although their mission in Great Moravia faced resistance from Frankish missionaries aligned with Rome, the legacy of Cyril and Methodius endured. Their disciples continued their work in the Bulgarian Empire and Kievan Rus, establishing monasteries, schools, and scriptoria that embedded Byzantine religious culture into Slavic society. In Bulgaria, Christianization was particularly transformative. Under Khan Boris, later Boris Michael after baptism, Bulgaria adopted Orthodox Christianity in the mid-9th century. Choosing orthodoxy over Western Christianity was partly political. By aligning with Constantinople, Boris asserted independence from Western Europe and gained prestige from the Eastern Empire. Byzantine clergy and scholars helped establish the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which eventually achieved autonomy while maintaining ties to Constantinople. Boris's son, Simeon I, presided over a golden age of Bulgarian culture, influenced by Byzantine models. Slavic literary culture, church architecture, and Orthodox theology reflected this heritage. Beyond Bulgaria, Byzantium's most dramatic influence came with the conversion of Kievan Rus, a federation of East Slavic tribes in modern Ukraine and Western Russia. Its rulers had long maintained commercial and military contact with Byzantium. According to tradition, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, seeking a unifying religion, investigated neighboring faiths. He was reportedly impressed by Orthodox liturgy in Constantinople, particularly at Hagia Sophia, and chose orthodoxy for his realm. Vladimir was baptized with his court and nobles and married the Byzantine princess Anna. This dynastic marriage symbolized spiritual and cultural integration and established permanent Byzantine influence in Kievan Rus. Following Vladimir's conversion, Byzantine clergy, architects, and artists entered the region. Churches were built in Constantinopolitan style. Monasteries were founded, liturgy and church law adopted. Over time, Kievan Rus developed a local Orthodox culture closely aligned with Byzantium. This expansion of orthodoxy solidified Byzantium's spiritual leadership in Eastern Christianity, ensuring Eastern Europe remained culturally distinct from the Latin West. It laid the foundation for future Slavic Orthodox civilizations, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church, which later claimed Byzantium's legacy. Cultural expansion went beyond religion. Byzantine art, law, and court ceremony influenced Slavic lands. Mosaics and icons inspired local styles. Imperial governance models emphasizing centralized authority and divine legitimacy were emulated. Clothing, architecture, and cuisine reflected Byzantine tastes. This cultural exchange was not one-sided. Slavic soldiers served in the imperial army. Slavic mercenaries protected the emperor. Slavic languages appeared in imperial records and inscriptions. New Christian Slavic states acted as buffers against nomadic or pagan threats, stabilizing Byzantium's northern frontier and serving as allies in wars. The spread of Orthodox Christianity among the Slavs was among the Macedonian period's most significant achievements. It extended Byzantine influence far beyond the empire's shrinking borders, ensuring that culture and religion endured well beyond Constantinople. By the early 11th century, Byzantium was not just a state, but the center of a broader Orthodox Christian world, stretching from the Peloponnese to the forests of Russia. This network of faith, language, and shared tradition would continue to shape Eastern Europe long after Byzantium's political fortunes declined. By the early 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood as a regional superpower. It had survived devastating eastern losses, endured internal religious strife, reasserted dominance in the Balkans, and extended cultural and religious influence into Slavic lands. Under the Macedonian dynasty, Byzantium achieved military victories, intellectual resurgence, and administrative stability. Yet even at its peak, seeds of decline were sown. The death of Emperor Basil II marked a critical turning point. Basil had ruled with iron discipline, keeping aristocratic ambitions in check and ensuring the strength of the army and treasury. If you want, I can also continue seamlessly into the post-Basil II period, showing how the empire declined politically while its cultural and religious influence persisted, keeping the same detailed, uninterrupted narrative style. But he left no children to succeed him. With no clear line of inheritance, the imperial court entered a period of uncertainty. Over the following decades, a series of short-lived and increasingly ineffective emperors assumed the throne, many lacking the experience, discipline, or authority needed to maintain the empire's delicate balance. The weakening of central authority allowed powerful noble families to reassert themselves. Landed aristocrats in Asia Minor, many veterans of Basil II's campaigns, began consolidating large estates. These magnates undermined the old system of free peasant soldiers and challenged imperial taxation, reducing the state's financial base. Without consistent tax revenue and a reliable supply of manpower, the once formidable Byzantine military system began to unravel. Military decline was further exacerbated by policy shifts under the new emperors. Rather than investing in the training and upkeep of native troops, many rulers relied increasingly on foreign mercenaries. These soldiers, drawn from across Europe and beyond, lacked loyalty to the empire and were costly to maintain. While capable of short-term support in emergencies, Their presence eroded the long-standing tradition of citizen soldiers who had once formed the backbone of Byzantine defense. Court politics also became increasingly unstable. Factionalism, fueled by rival noble families and bureaucrats, led to frequent conspiracies, assassinations, and palace coups. The throne became a prize sought through manipulation rather than merit, and emperors spent more time securing their own survival than governing effectively. One illustrative example of this decline was Emperor Constantine Monomachos. He ascended through dynastic marriage, but his reign was marked by extravagance, corruption, and military negligence. He disbanded provincial militias to cut costs, weakening local defenses while favoring intellectuals and court officials over experienced generals, alienating the military class. This shift toward an over-centralized bureaucracy eroded the empire's practical capabilities. While Constantinople displayed splendor and cultural sophistication, the provinces grew increasingly vulnerable to external threats and internal mismanagement. In the east, weakening frontier defenses became a growing concern. Turkish nomadic groups, particularly the Seljuk Turks, began pushing into Byzantine territory in Asia Minor. Initially sporadic, these incursions grew bolder and more organized as Byzantine military presence declined. Simultaneously, in the Balkans, the empire struggled to maintain its recent conquests. Although Bulgaria had been subdued under Basil II, local resistance simmered, and imperial administrators often ruled with heavy-handedness. Over time, resentment toward Constantinople increased, weakening Byzantine control over the region. Another blow came from the growing divide between Eastern and Western Christianity. Tensions, building for centuries, culminated in the Great Schism of 1054, when representatives of the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated one another. While daily life remained largely unchanged, the act symbolized a permanent break between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, complicating Byzantine relations with Western Europe for generations. Culturally, the 11th century was not devoid of achievement. Constantinople's universities and monasteries remained centers of learning. Art and architecture flourished, churches were built in elaborate styles, and religious scholarship developed further. Yet these cultural accomplishments contrasted sharply with the decaying foundations of administration and defense. One of the few emperors who attempted to reverse the decline was Romanos IV of Diogenes. A military man by training, Romanos sought to restore discipline to the army and reinforce eastern frontiers against the Seljuk Turks. He led an ambitious campaign into Asia Minor, culminating in the fateful Battle of Manzikert in the mid-11th century. At Manzikert, the Byzantine army confronted the Seljuks under Sultan Alp Arslan. This engagement would become one of the most disastrous defeats in Byzantine history, though its full consequences will be explored later. It is essential to understand that the events leading to Manzikert were shaped by systemic problems: court intrigue, military decay, and fiscal erosion. The empire did not collapse suddenly. It gradually abandoned the structures that had sustained its earlier revival. The road to decline was marked by short-sighted decisions, internal divisions, and missed opportunities. The 11th century emperors inherited a powerful legacy, yet few possessed the vision or strength to preserve it. As a result, the empire grew fragile, dependent on mercenaries, and vulnerable to both external enemies and internal factions. On the eve of one of its greatest defeats, Byzantium appeared majestic, but hollowed out by years of negligence and overreach. By the mid-11th century, the empire stood on a precipice. Decades of internal instability, a weakening military structure, and short-sighted leadership had hollowed out institutions that had once made Byzantium formidable. While Constantinople displayed opulence and ceremonial grandeur, its capacity to project military power, especially in Asia Minor, had drastically diminished. It was in this context that Emperor Romanos IV of Diogenes took the throne. Aware of the growing Seljuk threat in the east, he sought to confront them directly and reassert Byzantine authority in Anatolia. The Seljuks, led by Sultan Alp Arslan, had been making increasingly frequent incursions into the empire's eastern provinces, threatening its economic and agricultural heartlands. Asia Minor was critical. It supplied manpower, food, urban centers, imperial estates, and the lands of powerful military aristocrats. Its defense was not a mere frontier concern, it was a question of survival. Romanos assembled one of the largest imperial armies in recent memory. The campaign, launched in the early 11th century, aimed to re-establish Byzantine dominance in the east and demonstrate that imperial authority remained intact. However, the army reflected the broader decline of Byzantine military organization. It included native troops alongside mercenaries, Normans, Turks, Armenians, and others, all lacking cohesion and unified purpose. Loyalty was uncertain and coordination among such a diverse force was difficult. Initially, the march east met little resistance. Seljuk forces engaged in other conflicts had not expected such deep penetration into their territory, but Alp Arslan quickly redirected his forces to intercept the Byzantines near Manzikert, in present-day eastern Turkey. The two armies clashed in the summer of 1071. Despite initial advantages, the Byzantine army failed to maintain a unified front. Conflicting interests among Romanos's generals, poor communication, and mercenary suspicion led to a breakdown.
One of the most damaging moments came from Andronikos Doukas, a rival noble commanding the reserve.
He withdrew his troops and spread false rumors that the emperor had been killed, causing panic. The collapse was catastrophic. The Byzantine army was routed, thousands were killed or captured. Romanos himself was taken prisoner by Alp Arslan, becoming one of the few Byzantine emperors captured in battle. According to later accounts, Alp Arslan treated him with unexpected magnanimity, negotiating a peace treaty, imposing a modest ransom, and eventually releasing Romanos. Romanos's return to Constantinople did not restore stability. Political fallout was immediate. His enemies in the capital, who had opposed the campaign, seized power. Romanos was captured again, this time by fellow Byzantines, and subjected to blinding, a cruel but common punishment for disgraced rulers. He died shortly after from his wounds. The consequences of Manzikert were deeper than the battle itself. While the Seljuks did not immediately conquer vast territories, the loss of military prestige and political coherence shattered Byzantine control over Asia Minor. Local commanders, recognizing imperial weakness, could no longer resist Turkish incursions. Peasant communities fled, cities were abandoned or captured. Within a decade, much of central Anatolia had fallen under Seljuk control. The Seljuks established the Sultanate of Rum, permanently altering the region's demographic and religious makeup. Turkish-speaking Muslim communities replaced Greek-speaking Christian ones. The Byzantine heartland, once secure and productive, became a contested frontier. Economic consequences were severe. The loss of Anatolia dramatically shrank the empire's tax base. Agricultural production declined, along with trade revenues. The state struggled to fund military obligations, hire mercenaries, or maintain infrastructure. Religiously and psychologically, Manzikert was demoralizing. For centuries, Byzantium had seen itself as the divinely sanctioned protector of Christian civilization. Previous defeats had been followed by recoveries. But Manzikert signaled a new reality. The empire could no longer defend its core territories. Its image as the invincible bulwark of Christianity was questioned by both enemies and citizens. Compounding the crisis was growing tension between central authority and provincial aristocrats. Local magnates operated independently, carving their own power bases. The old system of loyalty and service to the emperor gave way to regionalism and factionalism. The empire faced multiple threats. In the Balkans, rebellious groups tested Byzantine control. In the Mediterranean, Norman adventurers eyed Byzantine possessions. In the east, the Seljuks continued to expand. Perhaps the most dangerous threat, however, was internal. the erosion of confidence in imperial leadership, and the collapse of central control. Following Manzikert, emperors came and went rapidly, many unable to restore order or unity. The military system, already fragmented, continued to decay. Recruitment faltered, fortifications fell into disrepair, and the once mighty Byzantine navy shrank in size and capacity. The empire had not yet fallen, but it was in free fall. After the catastrophic defeat and ensuing political chaos, the Byzantine Empire stood at one of its lowest points. Much of Asia Minor had fallen to the Seljuks. The treasury was nearly empty and the military fractured. Weak emperors failed to reverse the decline. While factionalism continued to undermine authority, amid this crisis, a new dynasty emerged, temporarily halting the empire's downward spiral and restoring a measure of stability, strength, and pride. This was the Komnenian dynasty, a noble family of military origin that would dominate Byzantine politics for over a century. Their rise marked a crucial phase of recovery known as the Komnenian Restoration, during which the empire reasserted control over parts of its lost territory, strengthened its institutions, and re-engaged with the wider Christian world. The founder of this resurgence was Alexios I Komnenos, who seized the throne in the year 1081. Alexios came from a respected aristocratic family with deep military roots. At the time of his accession, the empire faced external threats from nearly every direction. In the west, the Normans under Robert Guiscard were invading from southern Italy. In the east, the Seljuk Turks controlled much of Asia Minor. In the Balkans, the Pechenegs and other nomadic tribes regularly raided imperial lands. Internally, the treasury was drained and the army had become unreliable. Alexios acted swiftly. His early reign was marked by urgent efforts to consolidate power, raise funds, and rebuild the military. He turned to the church and aristocracy for support, granting privileges in exchange for loyalty. One of his more controversial decisions was to melt down church treasures to pay mercenaries, a desperate but necessary move to prevent immediate collapse. Perhaps the most consequential action of Alexios's reign came in diplomacy. Realizing that the empire could not recover Asia Minor without outside help, he appealed to the Latin West for military assistance. In a letter to Pope Urban II, he requested support from Western knights to fight the Seljuks and reclaim lost Christian lands. The request, modest in intent, helped spark a far larger movement, the First Crusade. Pope Urban II, seeing an opportunity to unite Western Christendom and extend papal influence, launched the crusade at the Council of Clermont in the year 1095. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and peasants answered the call, setting off for the Holy Land. For Alexios, the arrival of the Crusaders brought both opportunity and risk. The relationship between the Byzantines and the Crusaders was complex from the start. Many Western leaders, such as Bohemond of Taranto, had their own ambitions and little understanding of Byzantine customs. Alexios, cautious as ever, required the crusade leaders to swear oaths of loyalty and promise to return any captured territory to the empire. Though the arrangement led to tensions, it also yielded results. As the Crusaders advanced through Asia Minor, they recaptured important cities like Nicaea and Antioch, which were eventually returned, at least in theory, to Byzantine control. The First Crusade thus provided Alexios with a strategic advantage. While he did not control the entire campaign, he leveraged it to recover key territory and bolster his legitimacy. By the end of his reign, the empire had regained much of Western Asia Minor and stabilized its European borders. Alexios's achievements laid the foundation for the reign of his son, John II Komnenos, who ruled for over 2 decades. John was less flamboyant than his father, but proved to be a competent and thoughtful ruler. He continued military and administrative reforms, working to reduce corruption, strengthen the army, and re-establish imperial authority in disputed regions. Under John, the empire expanded its influence in the Balkans and launched campaigns into Anatolia and Cilicia. He was known for personal discipline and devotion to duty, earning respect from both army and court. Though his reign lacked major territorial conquests, he preserved the stability achieved by his father and left the empire in strong hands. That strong hand belonged to his son, Manuel III Komnenos, who ascended the throne in the mid-12th century. Manuel was a bold and energetic emperor, eager to project Byzantine power across the Mediterranean and reassert the empire's role as a leading Christian state. His reign represented both the high point and the limits of the Komnenian restoration. Manuel adopted a more aggressive foreign policy than his predecessors. He intervened in Hungarian politics, conducted campaigns in southern Italy, and maintained diplomatic relations with the Crusader states, the papacy, and even Islamic powers of the East. His court welcomed Western knights and scholars, and he often dressed in Western style, earning both admiration and suspicion from his subjects. One of his most ambitious actions was a campaign against the Normans in southern Italy. While ultimately unsuccessful in reclaiming the region, the campaign demonstrated the renewed confidence of the Byzantine military. Closer to home, he waged a lengthy and inconclusive war against the Seljuks in Asia Minor. Despite initial successes, his army suffered a major setback at the Battle of Myriokephalon, where terrain, overextension, and misjudgment led to a stinging defeat. This battle, fought in the late 12th century, was not as catastrophic as Manzikert, but carried symbolic weight. It marked the end of large-scale Byzantine attempts to reconquer central Anatolia. The limits of the Komnenian revival had been reached. Though the empire remained powerful and wealthy, its resources were stretched thin, with no clear path to full recovery of its former lands. Internally, the Komnenian period saw significant changes in imperial governance. The emperors increasingly relied on extended family and noble allies, consolidating power among a small elite. While this provided short-term loyalty, it created long-term instability. Succession became a matter of family negotiation rather than institutional order, and powerful aristocrats acted with greater autonomy economically. The empire remained prosperous through much of the 12th century. Trade with Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, brought wealth into Constantinople. However, privileges granted to these Italian merchants, including tax exemptions and trading rights, gradually undermined the empire's control over its own economy. Native merchants were pushed aside and resentment toward foreign influence grew. By the end of Manuel's reign, the empire still appeared strong outwardly. Its armies marched abroad, diplomacy remained active, and the capital was the largest and most sophisticated city in Europe. Yet beneath this confidence, structural weaknesses were emerging. The Komnenian emperors had halted decline and reversed some losses, but their revival rested on fragile foundations, reliance on the military aristocracy, costly foreign adventures, and dependence on foreign trade partners. As the century closed, these pressures were set to intensify. During the Komnenian revival, the Byzantine Empire reasserted its military and diplomatic presence across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, even as it stabilized internally and projected strength abroad, tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity deepened. These tensions, rooted in theological disagreements and cultural divergence, were accelerated by the very movement that had once aided the empire: the Crusades. The crusading era began with the First Crusade, initiated in part by Alexios's call for help against the Seljuks in Asia Minor. The Pope's response was far more ambitious than Alexios had anticipated. Instead of sending a disciplined contingent, the West mobilized a mass movement of armed pilgrims, nobles, and adventurers, arriving in Constantinople in waves. Alexios attempted to manage their arrival carefully, demanding oaths of loyalty and coordinating their passage through imperial territory. The First Crusade achieved remarkable military success, capturing Jerusalem and establishing Crusader states in the Levant. However, relations between the Byzantines and Latin Crusaders were fraught with suspicion, cultural misunderstandings and conflicting goals. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as undisciplined and disrespectful of imperial authority. Latin leaders, in turn, saw Byzantines as untrustworthy, especially amid rumors that Alexios had failed to support Antioch or made secret deals with Muslim rulers. These suspicions sowed lasting distrust. Over the following decades, Byzantine emperors dealt with the Crusader states through diplomacy and occasional military support. Yet with each successive crusade, relations grew more complicated. The Second Crusade, launched in the mid-12th century, passed through Byzantine territory with hostility. Western leaders treated Constantinople less as a partner and more as a rival. Although the crusade ended in failure in the Holy Land, it further deteriorated East-West relations. By the Third Crusade, tensions had worsened. After Jerusalem fell to Saladin in the late 12th century, Western Europe mobilized again. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire led a massive army through Byzantine territory en route to the Levant. Relations were openly hostile, with Byzantium viewing the army's passage as a potential invasion. Beneath these military episodes lay deeper causes of estrangement. The Great Schism of the mid-11th century had formally divided Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Attempts to heal the breach proved insufficient, as theological and jurisdictional differences remained unresolved. Disputes over papal primacy, the Filioque clause, and liturgical practices widened the gap. Mutual accusations of heresy and excommunications hardened religious identities. Cultural differences fueled the divide further. Byzantines, steeped in Greek language and Orthodox tradition, viewed Latins as uncultured and arrogant. Western Europeans saw Byzantines as effeminate, overly diplomatic, and spiritually compromised. These prejudices shaped public perception and political rhetoric on both sides. Economic tensions added another layer. During the Komnenian period, Byzantine emperors granted generous trading privileges to Italian city-states such as Venice, Pisa, and Genoa. These arrangements brought goods and maritime support, but allowed foreign merchants to dominate Byzantine markets. Native traders were sidelined, and resentment toward Latins grew in Constantinople. A significant flashpoint occurred during Manuel I's reign. His pro-Western leanings and close ties to Latin powers alienated many subjects. Anti-Latin sentiment intensified, with periodic riots targeting Westerners. These eruptions reflected broader social frustration with foreign influence and Byzantine dependence on Western trade. After Manuel's death, the situation became more volatile. The empire fell into political instability with competing factions and short-lived rulers. Anti-Latin hostility boiled over in a major riot, the Massacre of the Latins, in late 12th century Constantinople. Thousands of Western Europeans, mainly merchants and families, were killed, and Latin churches and homes looted. The massacre shocked Western Europe, hardened attitudes, and planted seeds of vengeance. Many in the West now viewed Byzantines not as fellow Christians but as traitors. By the end of the 12th century, Byzantium's internal weaknesses were clear. Succession disputes, court intrigue, and a shrinking military made the empire vulnerable. At the same time, rising Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice, shifted the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. These tensions set the stage for one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in Byzantine history, the Fourth Crusade. Unlike earlier crusades directed at the Holy Land, the Fourth Crusade became entangled in Constantinople's politics. A series of convoluted events, including financial deals with Venice and the appeal of a deposed Byzantine prince, led the crusading army to target the imperial capital. The result was not defense of Christianity against Islam, but a brutal betrayal. The Fourth Crusade would sack Constantinople and bring about the temporary dismemberment of the Byzantine Empire. That story belongs to the next chapter. For now, it is enough to understand that the groundwork had already been laid. Years of mistrust, economic exploitation, religious conflict, and cultural arrogance had undermined what had once been a fragile but functional East-West relationship. The Byzantines, proud of their imperial heritage and orthodox faith, were increasingly isolated. The Latins, driven by religious fervor, economic ambition, and wounded pride, began to see Constantinople not as an ally, but as a prize. The Crusades, once a lifeline against the Seljuks, had become a force of division. Instead of healing Christendom's wounds, they revealed its deepest fractures. And in the early 13th century, those fractures would tear the Byzantine world apart. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal discord and estranged from the Latin West, stood vulnerable at the dawn of the 13th century. For generations, mistrust had simmered between Eastern Orthodox Byzantium and the Catholic powers of Western Europe. Now, in a tragic convergence of political ambition, economic interests, and religious indifference, that mistrust erupted into violence. In the year 1204, the Crusaders, sworn defenders of Christendom, turned their swords not against Muslim forces, but against their fellow Christians in Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade would become one of the most infamous episodes in medieval history. The original aim of the Fourth Crusade, proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in the year 1198, was to retake Jerusalem, which had fallen to Muslim forces under Saladin a few years earlier. However, from its earliest stages, the crusade faced logistical and financial difficulties. The Crusaders, lacking funds to transport themselves to the Holy Land, made a deal with Venice, a powerful maritime republic, to provide ships in exchange for payment and military assistance. When the Crusaders failed to raise the full amount, the Venetians proposed an alternative: assist in capturing the Adriatic city of Zara, which had rebelled against Venetian control. Though Zara was a Christian city under papal protection, the Crusaders, desperate and indebted, agreed. The Pope excommunicated the crusading force for attacking fellow Christians. But the expedition pressed on, its mission drifting further from its original purpose. Amid this confusion arrived a new opportunity that would change the Crusades' course entirely. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, reached out to the Crusaders with a bold proposal. His father had been overthrown and blinded by Alexios III, who now ruled Constantinople. The younger Alexios promised the Crusaders substantial rewards: money, troops, supplies, and church unity if they helped him reclaim the throne. To many Crusader leaders, this offer was irresistible. It provided a clear goal, financial gain, and justification to approach Constantinople. Venice also saw advantages. By influencing imperial succession, they could secure trade privileges and dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Despite the Pope's objections, the Crusaders agreed. In 1203, the crusading army sailed to Constantinople. The city, despite its diminished power, remained formidable. Its walls, famed for height and strength, had repelled countless invaders over centuries, yet internally it was deeply divided. Emperor Alexios III, weak and unpopular, failed to organize effective resistance. As the Crusaders approached, he fled the city with his treasury, leaving the capital in disarray. The Crusaders entered Constantinople and installed Alexios IV, son of Isaac II, as co-emperor alongside his restored father. But Alexios IV quickly discovered he had made promises he could not keep. The Byzantine treasury was empty, and the population resented the Latin presence. Attempts to raise funds led to heavy taxation and unrest. Tensions escalated between citizens and crusaders, who behaved less like liberators and more like occupiers.
Riots broke out in the city.
Churches were looted, neighborhoods burned, and mutual hostility intensified. Amid the chaos, Alexios IV was overthrown by a palace coup. A court official named Ducas Mortuos seized power, declared himself Emperor Alexios V, and attempted to drive out the Crusaders. This act sealed Constantinople's fate. With their ally dead and promises unpaid, the Crusaders, frustrated and running low on provisions, prepared to take the city by force. On the 9th of April, 1204, the Crusaders launched a full assault. After several days of fighting, they breached the walls. On the 12th of April, they entered the city. What followed was not a military occupation, it was a sack. For 3 days, Constantinople endured looting, arson, and violence. Churches were stripped of relics and treasures. Sacred icons were smashed, altars desecrated, and priceless manuscripts burned. The Hagia Sophia, once the heart of Orthodox Christianity, was violated and temporarily converted into a Latin cathedral. Gold and silver were ripped from palaces, monasteries, and tombs. Soldiers rampaged through the streets, stealing, destroying, and committing atrocities. Accounts from the time, both Latin and Greek, described the horror with sorrow and shame. Even some crusaders were appalled, yet others reveled in plunder. The Venetians, more disciplined than their allies, carefully seized valuable relics and artworks, many transported back to Venice, where they remain to this day. By the end of the sack, the Queen of Cities lay in ruins. The architectural and artistic glory of Constantinople, built over centuries, had been gutted in days. The damage was not merely physical, it was civilizational. A great center of Orthodox Christianity and Roman imperial tradition had been desecrated by fellow Christians. The schism between East and West, already formalized in doctrine, was now violently realized in action. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established a Latin empire in place of the Byzantine state. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned Emperor of Constantinople, and Latin nobles divided Byzantine territory among themselves. The Orthodox clergy were displaced, and the Latin Church attempted to impose its authority on Eastern Christians. However, the Latin Empire proved weak and unstable. It lacked legitimacy among locals, struggled to hold territory, and faced constant resistance from surviving Byzantine successor states. Chief among these were the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond, all founded by Byzantine nobles and military leaders who refused to accept the loss of their world. Of these, the Empire of Nicaea emerged as the most powerful. From its stronghold in Western Asia Minor, the Nicene emperors gradually reclaimed territory, rebuilt institutions, and preserved Byzantine traditions in exile. Over the next decades, they mounted the long struggle to restore the fallen empire. The Empire of Trebizond was the first to be established. Located on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea, it was founded by 2 grandsons of Emperor Andronikos III, Alexios, and David Komnenos, just before Constantinople's fall. Though isolated and small, Trebizond maintained independence due to strong fortifications, strategic trading position, and distance from Latin territories. It endured as a regional power well into the 15th century, though it never seriously challenged Constantinople. To the west, in the region of Epirus, another Greek polity took shape under Michael Komnenos Doukas, a member of the extended imperial family. The Despotate of Epirus quickly expanded influence across western Greece and parts of the Balkans. It developed its own political and military structures, maintained Orthodox identity, and at times rivaled other successor states in claiming imperial authority. However, the most significant of these successor states was the Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore III Lascaris, son-in-law of the last Byzantine emperor before the Latin conquest. Escaping Constantinople's destruction, Theodore established his court in Nicaea, a city in northwestern Asia Minor. From there, he gathered loyal administrators, clergy, and soldiers, laying the foundation for a new Byzantine polity. Unlike Trebizond and Epirus, Nicaea possessed the resources, population, and proximity to challenge the Latin Empire directly. Theodore I carefully built alliances with local rulers, fortified key cities, and reconstituted Byzantine administrative structures. He also maintained close cooperation with the Orthodox Church, displaced from Constantinople and now residing in Nicaea. In the absence of a patriarch in Constantinople, a new ecumenical patriarch was appointed in exile. underscoring the Nicene emperor's claim to legitimacy. They positioned themselves not merely as regional rulers but as the continuation of Byzantine imperial tradition. Though their capital was now Nicaea, their eyes remained fixed on Constantinople. Theodore's successors continued to expand Nicaea's power. His son-in-law, John III, Ducas Vatatzes, ruled with military skill and administrative acumen. Under John III, Nicaea consolidated control over much of Western Asia Minor and gradually pushed into European territory, reclaiming lands from the weakened Latin Empire. John III also pursued cultural preservation and economic recovery. He supported agriculture, trade, and education. Monasteries and schools flourished, and manuscripts were copied and preserved. Even in exile, Byzantine intellectual life endured. John III's reign saw the creation of a functioning court, trained army, and stable bureaucracy, essential for any future reconquest. Meanwhile, relations between the three Greek successor states were complex. At times they cooperated against Latin occupiers. At others they competed for recognition and territory. The despotate of Epirus, particularly under Theodore Komnenos Doukas, declared himself emperor and occupied Thessalonica, the empire's second city. For a time, it seemed Epirus might surpass Nicaea in reclaiming Constantinople. However, a crushing military defeat against the Bulgarians halted its rise, and Nicaea regained the upper hand. The Latin Empire in Constantinople, though initially triumphant, struggled to maintain control. It faced constant pressure from surrounding enemies, internal instability, and limited resources. Latin rulers never secured loyalty of the local Orthodox population, and efforts to Latinize the Church deepened resentment. Constantinople itself suffered economic decline and population loss, a shadow of its former self. By the mid-13th century, the Latin Empire was in decline, while the Empire of Nicaea was growing stronger. Under Michael VIII Palaiologos, Nicaea made its final push to reclaim the imperial capital. Michael had risen to prominence as a general and politician, and soon declared himself co-emperor alongside the young heir John IV Lascaris. But in practice, Michael held the true power. After a palace coup and the blinding of the boy emperor, a brutal yet familiar tactic in Byzantine politics, Michael ruled alone. In the year 1261, the long-awaited opportunity arrived. A Latin garrison had been left vulnerable as Latin Emperor Baldwin II marched north on campaign. Michael's general, Alexios Strategopoulos, led a small force to Constantinople under the cover of darkness. With the help of local allies and by exploiting weak defenses, they entered the city through a secret passage and opened the gates. The Latin defenders were caught off guard. Baldwin fled the city, and the remaining Latin troops offered little resistance. On the 25th of July, Michael VIII entered Constantinople in triumph. The city had returned to Byzantine hands after more than half a century in exile. Michael's restoration marked the end of the Latin Empire and the re-establishment of Byzantine rule over its traditional capital. The Empire of Nicaea was once again the Byzantine Empire. Michael VIII was crowned in the Hagia Sophia, and the Orthodox Patriarch returned to his rightful seat. Yet, what had been regained in territory had been lost in time and strength. The Constantinople Michael reclaimed was impoverished and damaged, its walls neglected, churches desecrated, and population depleted. The empire that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean was now a smaller, fragile state. Nonetheless, the reoccupation of Constantinople carried immense symbolic weight. It reaffirmed the continuity of the Byzantine tradition and restored a sense of imperial legitimacy. Michael VIII's regime would go on to strengthen the city's defenses and initiate repairs to churches and palaces. But challenges remained. The Palaiologan emperors who followed would rule over a diminished empire, constantly threatened by internal divisions, external enemies, and a shifting world beyond their control. The dream of a restored, powerful Byzantium had briefly flickered into life, but its foundations had changed. The empire was no longer a vast, multi-ethnic state. It was now a city-centered empire focused on a single, fading capital surrounded by rising powers. When Michael VIII re-entered Constantinople in 1261, he restored more than just a city. He revived the Byzantine imperial tradition that had been driven into exile for over half a century. The Latin occupation had ended, and once again, the double-headed eagle of Byzantium flew above the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Yet this restoration was in many ways symbolic. The empire Michael inherited bore little resemblance to the state that had once spanned 3 continents. Its treasury was empty, its territories fragmented, and its population diminished. The city itself, once the largest and richest in Christendom, was partially in ruins. Michael's triumph was real, but it marked the beginning of a slow, painful decline lasting over 2 centuries. He moved quickly to consolidate power and defend the empire's fragile gains. He repaired the city's walls, recalled Orthodox clergy, and initiated restoration of public buildings and churches damaged during the Latin occupation. Yet his reign was overshadowed by threats on multiple fronts. To the west, Latin states in Greece and the Aegean, remnants of the Crusader conquest, remained hostile. Venice, enraged by the loss of privileges under Latin rule, now viewed restored Byzantium as a commercial and political rival. To the north, the rising Serbian kingdom expanded rapidly, challenging Byzantine influence in the Balkans. In Asia Minor, Turkish beyliks, small, independent principalities formed after the fragmentation of the Seljuk Sultanate, pressed into former Byzantine territory. Michael's diplomatic efforts brought him into uneasy relations with the Catholic West. In a controversial move, he sought union with the Roman Church, hoping to gain Western support against potential invasions. The Union of Lyons, proclaimed in 1274, formally recognized the Pope's authority. However, the union was deeply unpopular in Byzantium. The Orthodox clergy and laity rejected papal supremacy, seeing the agreement as a betrayal of the faith. Michael faced widespread opposition and unrest. Despite diplomatic maneuvering and military campaigns, he could not recover many former imperial lands. His successors inherited a realm centered on Constantinople, but surrounded by growing threats and internal erosion. The Palaeologan dynasty continued to rule Byzantium from Constantinople for nearly 2 centuries. While emperors such as Andronikos II and Andronikos III attempted administrative reforms and military campaigns, they faced constant setbacks. The empire became increasingly reliant on mercenary forces, particularly Catalan companies and Turkish auxiliaries, whose loyalties were often questionable. Civil wars further weakened the state. The 14th century witnessed a series of internal conflicts, especially the civil war between Andronikos II and his grandson Andronikos III. Authority became decentralized, and local magnates gained power. The state apparatus that once projected imperial will across provinces was hollowed out. Local warlords, monasteries, and foreign merchants often wielded more influence than the emperor. Economically, Byzantium declined. Commercial privileges granted to Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa eroded imperial control over trade. Byzantine merchants were gradually pushed out of key markets and state revenue shrank. Inflation and currency debasement reflected the fiscal crisis. Abandoned land, population loss, and rural instability compounded the economic decline. Yet amidst political and economic decay, the Palaeologan era saw cultural flowering. Byzantine scholars, artists, and theologians continued producing works of lasting significance. The 14th century witnessed what is sometimes called the Palaeologan Renaissance, a revival of classical learning, religious mysticism, and artistic innovation. Intellectuals like Nikephoros Gregoras and Demetrios Kydonis engaged deeply with theology, philosophy, and science. Interest in ancient Greek texts grew, and some scholars translated classical works into Latin. influencing the early Italian Renaissance monastic movements, particularly around Mount Athos, produced theological debates, especially regarding hesychasm, a mystical tradition emphasizing inner prayer and stillness. Art and architecture reflected both continuity and creativity. Churches were built or renovated with intricate mosaics and frescoes, blending classical form with medieval spiritual depth. The Chora Church in Constantinople stands as one of the finest examples of late Byzantine artistic achievement. But cultural vitality could not mask military decline. The most serious external threat came from the rise of the Ottoman Turks. Originally one of many Turkish beyliks in Asia Minor, the Ottomans rapidly expanded under leaders such as Osman and Orhan. They transformed from a tribal state into a centralized, expanding empire. Their military prowess, flexible use of cavalry and infantry, and pragmatic incorporation of conquered peoples gave them a significant edge. Unlike fragmented Latin states or weakened Byzantine administration, the Ottomans offered political stability, religious tolerance within their Islamic framework, and effective governance. They were empire builders, positioning themselves as regional power inheritors. By Sultan Murad II's reign, the Ottomans had firmly established themselves in southeastern Europe. They captured Adrianople, made it their European capital, and advanced deep into the Balkans. Serbian, Bulgarian, and Albanian resistance had been largely subdued, with occasional flares led by leaders such as Skanderbeg. But no regional force could decisively halt Ottoman expansion. For the Byzantines, the Ottomans were both enemy and occasional ally. Desperate for survival, emperors including John V and later his son Manuel II navigated the Ottoman threat through diplomacy, tribute, and strategic marriages. The empire often submitted to vassalage, paid annual gold tributes, and even sent noble children, including imperial sons, to serve in the Ottoman court as hostages or administrators. These arrangements bought time, but at the cost of autonomy and dignity. Constantinople increasingly resembled a besieged outpost surrounded by Ottoman territory. Its economy, population, and morale steadily declined. While the imperial court's splendor remained symbolic, the Ottoman threat briefly receded during the reign of Bayezid II due to an extraordinary event: the invasion of Anatolia by Timur, the Central Asian conqueror also known as Tamerlane. In the early 15th century, Timur's forces defeated Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara, capturing the Sultan and plunging the Ottoman realm into internal strife, known as the Interregnum. This unexpected Ottoman crisis gave Byzantium a temporary reprieve. During this period, Emperor Manuel II embarked on an unprecedented diplomatic mission to Western Europe, becoming the first Byzantine emperor in centuries to travel through Italian and French cities. He sought military aid, financial support, and spiritual unity, offering once again to submit the Orthodox Church to Rome in exchange for protection. While he was received with curiosity and honor, practical assistance was minimal. Western Europe was absorbed in its own conflicts, including the 100 Years' War and political disputes within the Holy Roman Empire. Though minor expeditions were sent to aid Constantinople, they were never enough to change the balance of power. The Ottomans eventually recovered under Mehmed I and more decisively under Murad II. The interregnum ended, and the Sultanate was re-established stronger than before. Murad resumed campaigns in the Balkans and tightened Ottoman control around Constantinople. The empire was slowly being strangled. As the 15th century advanced, Byzantium's internal situation worsened. Religious divisions deepened, especially regarding union with Rome. Emperors, such as John VIII, pursued reconciliation, attending the Council of Florence to secure Western aid. At this council, the Orthodox delegation agreed to doctrinal concessions, including recognition of papal primacy and the controversial Filioque clause. However, the agreement sparked outrage in Constantinople. The majority of the population, led by monks, clergy, and influential theologians, rejected the union. They viewed the Latin Church as corrupt, arrogant, and spiritually compromised. To many Byzantines, union meant betrayal of their faith and heritage. The phrase, "better the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Pope," began to circulate, expressing a grim preference for Islamic rule over submission to Rome. Still, the final chapter had not yet been written. In the mid-15th century, a new sultan ascended the throne, young, brilliant, and determined to take Constantinople. His name was Mehmed II. Barely into his 20s, he demonstrated political skill, military ambition, and a deep understanding of history. He saw himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a world emperor in the Roman tradition. Taking Constantinople, the historic capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, was central to his vision. Mehmed began preparations in earnest. He constructed a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This new fort, completed in record time, allowed the Ottomans to control all naval traffic to and from the Black Sea and effectively block any resupply of Constantinople by water. The Byzantine emperor at this time was Constantine the Palaiologos, the last in a line of Roman rulers stretching back over a millennium. Brave and pious Constantine knew his city stood little chance against the full might of the Ottoman Empire. Still, he prepared for defense. The walls of Constantinople, though aged, were still formidable.
Engineers reinforced the gates.
Supplies were gathered. Appeals for aid were sent to the west. Some assistance arrived, a few hundred Genoese and Venetian troops along with a small fleet. A brilliant Genoese commander, Giovanni Justiniani, took charge of a key section of the land walls. But the total defending force numbered only several thousand men. In contrast, Mehmed commanded tens of thousands, complete with artillery, engineers, and naval forces. One of the Ottomans' most decisive advantages was their use of large cannons, including a massive bombard designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. These cannons were capable of damaging the once impregnable Theodosian walls, long the pride of Constantinople. By early spring of 1453, Mehmed had completed preparations. The city was surrounded by land and sea. On April 6th, the bombardment began. The final siege of Constantinople, the siege of a dying empire, had commenced. As spring unfolded, the final days of the Byzantine Empire approached. Constantinople, once the dazzling capital of the Eastern Roman world, was now surrounded by the mighty forces of Sultan Mehmed II. The siege would not only end Byzantium, but also mark the close of the medieval world and the rise of a new imperial power, the Ottoman Empire. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine V knew the odds were grim. The defenders, a mix of Byzantine citizens, foreign volunteers, and Genoese mercenaries, numbered perhaps only 7,000 to 8,000 men. They faced an Ottoman army estimated at several times that number, possibly as high as 80,000, though exact figures are debated. The Ottomans brought overwhelming manpower and a critical advantage in artillery. The walls of Constantinople had withstood Avars, Arabs, Rus, and Bulgars, but now, for the first time, they faced gunpowder. The Hungarian engineer Orban had built a massive bombard, requiring multiple oxen and hundreds of men to transport and operate. Alongside smaller cannons, the artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage on the Theodosian walls. From April 6th onward, cannonballs pounded the walls daily, creating breaches and forcing defenders to repair damage at night. During the day, they repelled repeated Ottoman assaults. Despite the attackers' superiority, the defense held for weeks, thanks largely to the leadership of Emperor Constantine and Giovanni Justiniani. Justiniani's presence on the land walls bolstered morale and instilled discipline, particularly near the St. Romanus Gate, where the bombardment was fiercest. Meanwhile, at sea, the small Byzantine fleet, along with a few Genoese and Venetian ships,
struggled to control the Golden Horn. Mehmed frustrated by the sea defenses,
devised a bold plan. Dozens of ships were hauled overland across greased logs from the Bosporus, bypassing the massive chain protecting the harbour. Ottoman ships emerged behind Byzantine lines, creating panic and further pressure on the defenders. Still, the city held. Western aid was promised but mostly failed to arrive. The Pope offered support, but only a few small contingents reached Constantinople. Western Europe remained absorbed in the 100 Years' War, internal Holy Roman disputes, and other conflicts. Inside the city, morale fluctuated. Over the past century, the population had dwindled, leaving many neighborhoods empty. Churches overflowed with citizens praying for deliverance. Religious processions wound through the streets, relics were carried along the walls, and divine intervention was fervently sought. By late May, the situation grew critical. Justinian was seriously wounded during an attack and had to be carried from the walls, causing confusion and dismay. Emperor Constantine, realizing the end was near, prepared for a final stand. According to tradition, on the evening of May 28th, he attended a last service in Hagia Sophia. Surrounded by nobles, soldiers, and citizens, he received communion, asked forgiveness from his subjects, and departed for the walls, a solemn farewell to his people and the city that had been the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. In the early hours of May 29th, under darkness and fog, the Ottomans launched their final assault. Waves of troops advanced toward the breaches. Defenders, though exhausted, resisted fiercely, but sheer numbers and pressure prevailed. At the St. Romanus Gate, Ottoman troops broke through. Emperor Constantine is believed to have cast aside his imperial regalia and fought as a common soldier. His exact fate is uncertain, but he likely fell in battle, later identified by the imperial purple boots he wore. His death marked the symbolic end of the empire. As Ottoman soldiers poured into the city, chaos ensued. Defenders were cut down, churches looted, and citizens taken prisoner. According to tradition, Mehmed allowed looting as was customary in the medieval world. Hagia Sophia, once the most revered church in Eastern Christendom, was stormed. Priests were interrupted mid-service and treasures seized. Later, Mehmed converted it into a mosque, preserving the structure but transforming its function. By midday, fighting subsided. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city, reportedly riding through the streets of the ruined capital to Hagia Sophia. There, he ordered an end to pillaging and declared the city under his protection. He recognized Constantinople not just as a military conquest, but as the symbolic and strategic center of a new empire. In the following days, Mehmed began rebuilding and repopulating the city. He invited Muslims, Christians, and Jews to settle there. He re-established the Orthodox Patriarchate under Ottoman oversight, allowing Christian worship alongside Islamic governance. Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Empire and eventually one of the great cities of the early modern world. For Byzantium, the fall of Constantinople marked the end of a historical arc over a millennium long. Founded by Constantine the Great as the New Rome, the city had bridged ancient and medieval East and West, Roman and Orthodox worlds. Through centuries of war, plague, renewal and decline, it preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy and Christian faith. Its final fall did not erase its legacy. Byzantine art, theology and scholarship influenced the Renaissance, particularly through exiled scholars fleeing to Italy. The Orthodox Church survived, maintaining traditions despite political subordination. And the idea of the empire, a blend of Roman governance, Christian universalism, and Hellenic culture, lived on in memory, liturgy, and political thought. When the last walls fell and the last emperor died, it was not merely a city changing hands, it was the end of a world and the beginning of another. The story of Byzantium is one of endurance, adaptation, and transformation. Born in the late Roman world, tested by Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Turks, Byzantium preserved and reshaped classical civilization for over 1,000 years. Its fall was tragic, but its legacy remains. This concludes the story of Byzantium, not merely as a fallen empire, but as a civilization that carried the light of Rome through darkness and passed it on to the world that followed. Hagia Sophia, once the most revered church in Eastern Christendom, was stormed. Priests were interrupted mid-service and treasures seized. Later, Mehmed converted it into a mosque, preserving the structure but transforming its function. By midday, fighting subsided. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city, reportedly riding through the streets of the ruined capital to Hagia Sophia. There, he ordered an end to pillaging and declared the city under his protection. He recognized Constantinople not just as a military conquest, but as the symbolic and strategic center of a new empire. In the following days, Mehmed began rebuilding and repopulating the city. He invited Muslims, Christians, and Jews to settle there. He re-established the Orthodox Patriarchate under Ottoman oversight, allowing Christian worship alongside Islamic governance. Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Empire and eventually one of the great cities of the early modern world. For Byzantium, the fall of Constantinople marked the end of a historical arc over a millennium long. Founded by Constantine the Great as the New Rome, the city had bridged ancient and medieval East and West, Roman and Orthodox worlds. Through centuries of war, plague, renewal and decline, it preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy and Christian faith. Its final fall did not erase its legacy. Byzantine art, theology and scholarship influenced the Renaissance, particularly through exiled scholars fleeing to Italy. The Orthodox Church survived, maintaining traditions despite political subordination. And the idea of the empire, a blend of Roman governance, Christian universalism, and Hellenic culture, lived on in memory, liturgy, and political thought. When the last walls fell and the last emperor died, it was not merely a city changing hands, it was the end of a world and the beginning of another. The story of Byzantium is one of endurance, adaptation, and transformation. Born in the late Roman world, tested by Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Turks, Byzantium preserved and reshaped classical civilization for over 1,000 years. Its fall was tragic, but its legacy remains. This concludes the story of Byzantium, not merely as a fallen empire, but as a civilization that carried the light of Rome through darkness and passed it on to the world that followed.